Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Albert Fish. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Hamilton Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. He said he had been named after Hamilton Fish, a distant relative. His father was 43 years older than his mother. Hamilton was the youngest child, and he had 3 other siblings. He wanted to be called Albert after one of his other dead siblings, and because he said he wanted to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs that was given to him at an orphanage that he spent many of his early years at. It is said that many members of Albert's family had mental illness. Now, 1875, Washington, D.C., Albert's mother put him into an orphanage. She could not properly care for him. He was frequently whipped and beaten at this orphanage and eventually discovered that he enjoyed the physical pain. The beatings would often give him erections, which the other orphans noticed and the other orphans teased him about. By 1879, his mother got a government job, so she was now able to care and look after him, so she got him back. But by then, Albert had some very, very odd traits happening. He started drinking urine at the age of 12 years old, and he drank it for sexual gratification. He also began visiting public baths where he would watch boys undress, and he spent a great portion of his weekends on these types of visits. By 1890, Albert had arrived in New York City, and he became a male prostitute. What he said was he began raping young boys, a crime he kept committing even after his mother arranged a marriage for him. In 1898, Albert was married to a woman, and together they had 6 children named Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Harry Fish. In January 1917, Albert's wife left him. She left him for another man. Now we're going to jump to May 25th, 1928. A man named Edward Budd put a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World paper that read, quote, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." End quote. A few days later, May 28th, 1928, Albert, who was then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan, New York City. However, when he introduced himself, he called himself Frank Howard, and he claimed he was a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. He used the pretense of hiring Edward for $15 a week. He even offered to hire Edward's friend Willie as well for employment. Well, Mr. Howard told the Budd family he had to leave for an appointment, but he promised to come back on Saturday to pick the boys up. Well, Saturday came, and Mr. Howard was nowhere to be found. This was June 2nd, 1928. Instead, later that day, a handwritten note from Albert, Mr. Howard, arrived, and it said that he'd been delayed but would call them in the morning. So that next day, Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, around 11 o'clock a.m., Mr. Howard arrived at the Budd's apartment. And when he arrived, he brought many gifts for the family. Fresh strawberries, fresh creamery pot cheese, a feast. He told them, quote, "These products come direct from my farm," end quote. Delia Budds, who was Edward's mother, persuaded Mr. Howard to stay for lunch. The family now had this wonderful opportunity to talk to Mr. Howard, to get to know their son's new employer better. Well, just when they sat down to have lunch, a 10-year-old girl named Gracie appeared. Mr. Howard was captivated by Gracie. Mr. Howard would say that he had to leave, but would come back later that evening to pick up the boys, Edward and Willie. But first, he had something to attend to. He had to go to a birthday party that his sister was throwing for one of her children. Well, just as Mr. Howard was about to leave, he invited Gracie to go with him to his niece's birthday party. What he told the Bud parents was he would take good care of Gracie and he would make sure that she would be home before 9 p.m. that evening. Well, Mrs. Buds asked him, where does your sister live? And what Mr. Howard responded was that she lived in an apartment house at Columbus and 137th Street. Well, that still didn't quite settle her need. She still was a little uncomfortable in letting her daughter go. So Mr. Bud, Gracie's father, convinced her it would be good for Gracie. What he said was, quote, "Let the poor kid go. She doesn't see much good times," end quote. So they did. They let her go with Mr. Howard. Well, later that evening, 9 p.m. came and went. There was no word from Mr. Howard, and there was no sign of Gracie. The next morning, the family went down to the police station. They went to report Gracie's disappearance. Well, the worst thing that the police lieutenant who spoke with the Budd family, named Samuel Tribbins, said to the Budd family was the address that Frank Howard gave them for his sister's apartment was fake. There was no such address. In fact, the kindly old man who was their son's new employer was a fraud. There was no Frank Howard. There was no farm in Farmingdale, Long Island. None of it was true. June 7th, 1928, New York police mailed out 1,000 flyers to police stations throughout the country with a photo of Gracie and the description they had of Mr. Howard. But sadly, nothing ever came of it. Now, November 1934, 7 years later, an anonymous letter was sent to Gracie's parents. I'm going to read part of the letter. You can find the whole letter online if you choose to read the whole portion. Now, what I'm going to quote is, "On Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, I called you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body," end quote. The envelope that this letter contained had a very important clue on it. There was a small hexagonal emblem that had the letters NYPCBA. Well, that stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Well, this was great. Authorities now had something to go on. When police visited this address, the landlady who was there was shocked when she was given this description of Frank Howard. Well, there was no Frank Howard, but that sounded just like the old man who had lived there for 2 months. Unfortunately, this old man had checked out of the rooming house just a few days earlier, so police just missed him. But it doesn't end there. December 13th, 1934, the landlady called police. The little old man who had checked out, he was back, Albert Fish was back. He was at the rooming house looking for a letter. He was still sitting there when police arrived. Albert stood up and nodded when police asked him if he was Albert Fish. Then suddenly, Albert reached into his pocket and produced a razor, the blade he held in front of him. Well, police were able to quickly grab Albert's hand, twist it sharply, and the blade fell from his hands onto the floor. Albert, now being interviewed by police, would confess, and his confession would be heard by many law enforcement officials and psychiatrists, and the public. But the public was so confused. Albert appeared as a frail-looking old man. He was stooped. He was about 130 pounds and only about 5 feet 5 inches tall. That didn't seem like a likely killer. Well, what Albert told police in detail was that in the summer of 1928, he had been overcome by what he called, quote, bloodthirst, end quote. This was his need to kill. When he answered the employment ad for Edward Budd, it was the young man, not his sister Gracie, that he intended to lure to a remote location, restrain him, cut off his penis, and leave him to bleed to death. However, he told police when he saw Gracie, he changed his mind. He changed his plans. It was she that he desperately wanted to kill. Albert stated that Gracie was so excited with the 40-minute ride into the countryside. The day he took her when he was supposed to go to his sister's birthday party for her niece. Only twice in her life had Gracie been out of the city. They walked along a remote road until they reached an abandoned 2-story building. This building was called Wisteria Cottage. It was in the middle of a wooded area. Next, Gracie played outside. She played amongst the wild flowers, while Albert sat up inside. What he did was he went to the second-floor bedroom, opened up his bundle of tools, and took off all of his clothes. Then he called Gracie to come inside and come upstairs. Gracie, not knowing what was happening in the house, came right into the house. She went right up to the bedroom. When she saw Albert naked, she screamed for her mother, and she tried to escape. However, it was no use. Albert grabbed her by her throat and choked her to death. He stated to police that he was sexually aroused by the act of strangling her. But that was not all. He was not done with Gracie. He then propped up her head on an old paint can and decapitated her, catching most of the blood in the paint can. Afterwards, he threw the bucket of blood out into the yard. He then undressed the headless child that went back to her body and cut her in two. He cut her using a butcher knife and a cleaver. Albert, after confessing to the murder of Gracie, confessed to another murder of Billy Gaffney. Well, who was Billy Gaffney? Billy had disappeared on February 11th, 1927. At that time, people in that community, they organized a search, but there was no sign of Billy. What happened, according to Albert Fish, was Billy was playing in the hallway outside of his family's apartment in Brooklyn, New York. He was playing with his friend named Billy Beaton. Well, both of the boys disappeared. However, it was later on that Billy Beaton was found. He was on the roof of the apartment house. When police asked him what happened to Billy Gaffney, Billy Beaton said, quote, "The boogeyman took him," end quote. Well, Joseph Meehan, who was a motorman on a Brooklyn trolley, ended up seeing a photo of Albert Fish in the newspaper. He identified him as the old man he saw that same day that was trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. That boy was crying. He wanted his mother. And Albert desperately tried to get him to be quiet. Police matched the description of this child to that of Billy Gaffney. However, to this day, Billy Gaffney's body has not been recovered. Albert confessed to the following in regard to Billy Gaffney's murder and disappearance. I will read part of the confession. Again, the rest of the confession you can find online. Quote, I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best, his monkey and peewees and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt and pepper. It was good, end quote. Albert told police in addition, quote, I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and have others inflict pain on me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt, end quote. But that was not all. Albert had been sticking needles into his body for years, and he was sticking them in the area between the rectum and the scrotum. At first, he said he'd only stuck these needles in and then pulled them out again. Then he had stuck others in so far that he was unable to get them out, so they stayed there. Well, a doctor had x-rayed him, and he did find needles. There were at least 29 needles in his pelvic region. You can find a picture of this online, by the way. March 11th, 1935, the trial of Albert Fish for the premeditated murder of Gracie Budd began in White Plains, New York. The trial lasted for 10 days. Albert pleaded insanity and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. The defense stated, quote, in spite of all these brutal, criminal, and vicious proclivities, there's another side to this defendant. He has been a very fine father. He has never once in his life laid a hand on one of his children. He says grace at every meal in his house. In 1917, when the youngest of one of his 6 children was 3, his wife left him. And from that time down until shortly before the Grace Budd murder in 1928, he was a mother and father to those children, end quote. They closed by reminding the jury that it was up to the prosecution to prove that a man who killed and ate children was sane. Well, the prosecution, they were ready to come back. They had Albert's own family testify. Albert's 17-year-old stepdaughter, Mary Nichols, described how Albert taught her and her brothers and sisters a game. This game involved overtones of masochism and child molestation. Albert's children had seen him hitting himself on his nude body with a nail-studded paddle until he was covered in blood. When the jury deliberated, they found him to be sane, and most importantly, they found him to be guilty. The judge ordered Albert Fish to the death penalty. After being sentenced, Albert then confessed to another murder. He confessed to the murder of 8-year-old Frances McDonald, who was killed on Staten Island. What he spoke of this murder was Frances was playing on the front porch of his home on July 15th, 1924, when he went missing. Frances's body was later found in the woods where a neighbor had seen Frances and a, quote, old man, end quote, going in earlier that afternoon. The boy had been assaulted and strangled with his own suspenders, while the witness saw the old man leave the forest alone. Albert Fish was executed on January 16th, 1936 in the electric chair. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m., was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. He was recorded to have said that electrocution would be the, quote, supreme thrill of my life, end quote. And that is the case of Albert Fish. Do you have any questions or any comments on the case? Leave it down below. Have you seen any of the X-ray pictures of Albert Fish? Read any of the letters that he sent to his victims' families? They're quite intense. Well, let's talk about it down below. Leave a comment. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you would like me to cover? Well, leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.